Paramilitary attacks, often referred to as punishment, beatings or shootings, are a legacy issue of the Troubles. They were used by the paramilitary during the conflict and still plague many of our most disadvantaged communities in Northern Ireland. The attacks take the form of both shootings, usually to the main joints, the knees, but also the ankles and elbows, and violent beatings with various weapons such as bats, metal bars and hammers, among many more. Paramilitary attacks were a tactic used by both Republican and Loyalist paramilitary groups to deal with what they saw as antisocial behaviour and crime in their communities, with paramilitary stepping into a policing and justice role in communities where people didn't trust or have confidence in the police force itself. Or, for many areas, people were not permitted to contact the police at all, instead being made to rely on this alternate form of policing and justice. This allowed them to be seen as dealing with local problems and to retain power in their communities through a culture of fear and intimidation. These attacks continue to serve the same purpose for a new generation of paramilitary groups. 20 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, these attacks continue and have been on the increase. Isn't it time we put a stop to this? In many working class areas, there are heavy levels of crime and antisocial behaviour. Those involved rarely seem to face any consequences for their actions. As a result, their victims become desperate, as the justice they need never seems to arrive. Even when people are arrested, they can be released immediately and carry on with their criminal or antisocial behaviour. Out of frustration, some go to the next available recourse to them: paramilitaries. Around half of the victims of these attacks are young people, including some children. They are members of the local community and are attacked by the people who often live in the same community. The victims of the attacks are often very traumatised and can be left with lifelong disabilities from their injuries. For every young person shot or beaten, there are several others who are threatened or excluded from their communities and isolated from their families and sources of support.
A paramilitary attack is when an organisation decides to take policing into their own hands and obviously takes some form of justice against someone, and it usually means a violent attack on that person based on no form of law and order or no form of justice.
I would hear a lot more about shootings in maybe West Belfast or different places, but I definitely think around here the main threat would be for beatings.
Generally, the person to be attacked will be warned, or they'll receive some sort of warning or some sort of house visit regarding their behaviour, but sometimes that isn't the case, and it will just be a premeditated attack carried out upon them. Some people have been text messages or received notifications on Messenger to show up to a certain place at a certain time.
I had gone out the gate of the youth centre when two masked men had ran by. I had walked up and at the back of the youth centre had found a young person who had been shot 4 times. He had been shot in both knees and then in both ankles. I had went over till, when I had ran over till a young person, the injuries were extremely, they were brutal. He was obviously crying in pain, and I had rang an ambulance for him, and over the phone with the ambulance service and my own first aid training, I was attempting to dress his wounds when I felt my finger get stuck, and when I looked down, my finger had went into the wound in the young lad's ankle.
I have seen a couple of patients where they've been shot in the leg where it has hit major blood vessels, and blood loss has been a huge factor, and trying to keep the patient alive, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to get blood products, blood that's been given by donors into the patient to try and keep them alive, keep their blood pressure up, whilst we're able to control the bleeding and get them to theatre. Yes, so I've seen several patients who have been near death because of shootings in the lower legs, and it's very difficult, particularly in young people with all their family there, etc., etc. It's a very difficult and emotional time, and in my experience, at least one of the the victims that I've seen who has unfortunately lost their life was down to beatings. In my experience, various tools are used in a vicious way. Bats with nails, hammers, screwdrivers, all types of weapons that can cause very, very serious injuries. And with a shooting, it's often once or twice. With a beating, there can be many, many blows with these implements which cause severe harm, both to bones, blood vessels, tissues. There can be swelling in the limbs, there can be orthopaedic surgeries needed, and often the patients are left very, very disabled for life. So yes, the beatings can be, on occasion, more severe than the shootings.
Correctional staff is just another negative reinforcement on the rest of the trauma calls that we would do. And we find that over time that actually getting repeated exposure, and although the number of attacks has maybe gone down and is starting to creep up, but to add that into the number of other trauma calls that we do, over time that can start to have a detrimental effect. And although we're currently starting to looking at new models where we have staff care line, where we can phone up, and we're looking at other counselling courses for staff, you know, just to identify which staff members aren't starting to cope with it anymore. And once we identify those staff, then we can get the help and the support that they need to deal with these type of calls.
And it doesn't just affect the victim. It affects their brothers and their sisters. It affects their mother and their father and their grannies and grandads. Do you know, you're not just shooting this young person, you're damaging the whole family. You're damaging the whole community.
On occasion, limbs have been amputated or lost. If they're not amputated or lost, there can be a disability in terms of difficulties with walking, with using their upper limbs. There can be difficulties with mobility, with working, with pain, with sleeping, with normal day-to-day activities. So that the physical side effects can be wide-ranging. And I think it's important to say that probably the psychological long-term effects are as important, if not more important, particularly in young people who have their whole lives ahead of them. To have been a victim of such a violent crime, it lives with them for the rest of their lives. They often suffer from mental health problems. There are problems with depression and suicide and self-harm, substance abuse, integrating back into society. There are problems with relationships with friends and family, with trust. So the impact is long-term and massive.
As a police officer, whoever it is that is breaking the law, then those are the people that we would be looking to arrest and put before the court. But the way we do that is from people helping us, from people coming forward and making statements of complaint, giving us enough evidence to put before the court. If people come forward and do that with us, either through the confidential line or directly, well then we can see paramilitarism eradicated from this country.
Attacks can be prevented with a pretty serious strategy and a set of resources to be able to help these young people. I don't think it's a place for youth workers. I think youth workers have a role in it, but I don't think it's all youth workers. I think we need to have teachers involved. We need to have psychologists and psychiatrists and mental health people, restorative justice organisations, the police, the judiciary, the Bar Association. There needs to be a pretty serious strategy around tackling this.
I think that there are solutions to these issues in communities all over the world. In other countries, people have community-based justice systems, and even in Northern Ireland, we have restorative justice models, which often work very well. For example, in Red Hook in Brooklyn, in New York, they have a community court. Members of the community are the jury in the court, and they have a judge who sits in the court, and in their system, if someone is accused of a crime, they might be in court the next day or a couple of days later. So it's dealt with very, very quickly. Whereas in Northern Ireland, sometimes it can take over a year for someone to go to court, even when they've been charged with something. There are also models where young people get involved, and there are different models of youth courts around the world. And I think those are good as well, because they teach young people about systems of law and justice and human rights. Whatever systems we adopt, they have to respect people's rights. We can't go on brutalising people. It's not acceptable in a modern democracy.
As a group of young people, we are very concerned about what we see happening in our communities. These attacks solve nothing and create a culture of fear and trauma. Isn't it time for these attacks to stop?